I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
Today, Saturday, January 10th, is a bad day for Sean Combs. Netflix has quietly released what 50 Cent is calling the next chapter of The Reckoning. And this time, it doesn't feel like a continuation. It feels like a message. There is no long promotional rollout, no months of buildup, no press tour explaining what was coming. It simply appeared, suddenly and without warning. Almost as if it wasn't meant to make noise at first, just to exist. And that alone says a lot. When powerful stories arrive quietly, they're usually not about entertainment. They're about timing. Back in December, when The Reckoning first dropped, many believed that was the complete story. For carefully structured parts explored Diddy's empire, the allegations, the investigation, the people around him, and the moment before everything unraveled. That documentary shook the industry. Careers went silent. Statements stopped. Conversations shifted. But even then, something felt incomplete. Certain moments ended too abruptly. Questions were raised, but never fully answered. Names were mentioned without context. Gaps felt deliberate. And 50 Cent never hid that fact. He repeatedly said what people saw was only a fraction of what existed. This new release confirms that. It doesn't revisit Diddy's rise. It doesn't reframe his legacy or guide casual viewers through familiar ground. It assumes you already watched what came out in December. This time, the focus moves away from the public narrative and toward what was happening behind closed doors. And that shift changes everything. The tone is tighter, heavier, more unsettling. Instead of long interviews and historical framing, the documentary feels restrained and uncomfortable. This isn't about reminding you who Sean Combs was. It's about questioning why certain things were never shown before and why they're being shown now. What makes this release disturbing isn't that it loudly claims to reveal new truths. It's how it reframes existing ones. Moments that once felt isolated now sit side by side. Conversations that seemed harmless suddenly carry weight. The lack of explanation becomes louder than any accusation ever could. And the timing matters. This doesn't drop in isolation. It arrives while legal appeals are pending, while civil lawsuits continue quietly, while the industry remains largely silent. People who once spoke freely are now choosing their words carefully or not speaking at all. That silence becomes part of the story. The documentary doesn't say, "Here's what happened." It asks, "Why was this never addressed?" And once that question is raised, it doesn't disappear. This chapter also feels different because it doesn't seem aimed at the audience first. It feels aimed inward, toward the industry itself, toward people who know exactly what certain clips, recordings, and images mean without them being explained. Not everything is spelled out, and that's intentional. Power isn't challenged by shouting. It's challenged by context. This chapter isn't loud. It's patient. It lets moments linger long enough for discomfort to settle in. And discomfort is dangerous when it stays. What you're watching isn't a sequel trying to outdo the first installment. It's a recalibration, a repositioning. Almost like someone saying, "You thought that was everything." It wasn't. And that realization that the story may not be finished is what makes today feel different. Because once the possibility of more exists, silence stops working the way it used to. What makes this chapter feel heavier is what it refuses to do. There's no dramatic narration telling you what to think, no flashing labels, no voice spelling out accusations. Instead, the documentary slows down and allows patterns to form naturally, placing moments next to each other and letting the audience connect the dots on their own. And that's far more unsettling than being handed a conclusion. You begin to notice how often certain names surface around the same situations. How timelines overlap in ways that were never openly discussed. How people who once appeared disconnected were actually moving through the same rooms, the same circles, the same nights. Nothing is shouted. Everything is suggested through proximity. And that's where the tension lives, because implication forces memory to do the work. This chapter also stands apart because it isn't built around public moments. It avoids award shows, red carpets, and interviews everyone has already seen. Instead, it lingers in the in-between spaces. After parties, private exchanges, planning stages, moments just before cameras were supposed to stop rolling. The kinds of moments that rarely make it into documentaries. You feel that tonal shift immediately. The pacing tightens. Scenes don't resolve the way you expect. Conversations end too soon. Footage cuts away right when your mind starts forming questions. That isn't accidental. It's restraint. And restraint signals confidence. It shows the creators aren't trying to persuade anyone. They're placing pieces on the table and stepping back. Another striking element is how carefully context is handled. Nothing appears in isolation. Every clip, every voice, every moment is framed by quiet buildup. You're shown where people were, who else was there, and how often these same groupings repeat over time. Repetition matters because repetition turns coincidence into pattern. And patterns, not isolated incidents, are what investigations are built on. There's also an emotional shift that's hard to ignore. The earlier documentary carried the energy of revelation. This one carries the weight of consequence. The tone feels colder, less reactive, almost resigned, as if the story has moved past shock and into the phase where reality settles in. That's when reputations are most at risk. Outrage fades, but records remain. What's especially notable is how little commentary is needed. Long stretches pass without explanation, yet the meaning continues to build. You're not told why something matters. You're shown just enough to understand that it does. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This chapter doesn't ask for belief. It assumes awareness. It trusts that viewers remember what was said months ago. Who denied what? Who stayed silent? Who spoke too early and then vanished? It trusts that you can feel the weight of what's missing just as strongly as what's present. That trust changes the relationship between the documentary and the audience. You're no longer being guided. You're being positioned as a witness. And that's where the real power lies. Because once a story shifts from watch this to remember this, it stops being content and starts becoming record. And records don't disappear quietly. By this point, something becomes clear. This isn't about new shock value. It's about reshaping what people thought they already understood. The documentary doesn't rush forward. It circles back. It revisits moments once treated as footnotes and places them at the center. Not to accuse, but to reframe. What once felt random now feels arranged. You start noticing how often stories were told without follow-ups. How many questions were acknowledged but never answered. How silence replaced clarity as the final response. And when those moments are stacked together, not years apart, but minutes apart, the tone shifts completely. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Not because of what's shown, but because of what suddenly makes sense. The documentary leans heavily into timing. When statements were made, when responses never came, when narratives quietly changed without explanation. It's subtle, but deliberate. It invites the viewer to consider whether time itself was used as a shield, not to heal, but to distance. Distance dulls urgency, and urgency is a threat to power. What makes this documentary so effective is its refusal to guide your reaction. There's no dramatic score signaling when it feels something. No captions spelling out what to think. Instead, moments are placed side by side and left to rub against each other. That friction creates heat. You begin recalling interviews you've seen before, but they land differently now. Answers that once sounded firm feel incomplete. Statements that were taken at face value now feel carefully chosen. Not untrue, just selective. And selection itself is a form of control. This chapter highlights the divide between public narratives and private handling. What was said on record? What stayed off camera? How often those two realities never aligned. It doesn't accuse anyone of lying. It exposes separation. And separation creates plausible deniability. The more you watch, the clearer it becomes that this isn't about one incident. It's about a method, a repeatable strategy for managing attention. Let something surface briefly. Allow the noise. Then wait. Waiting has always been the safest move, until people stop forgetting. That's the shift happening now. The audience isn't moving on. They're revisiting, replaying, comparing. And comparison strips narratives of their protective haze. What once felt like isolated controversy now feels connected, unfinished, part of a much larger conversation. The documentary never tells you what conclusion to reach. Instead, it removes the comfort of certainty. It leaves you with unresolved questions that were never meant to survive this long. And unresolved questions don't fade. They grow. At this point, the story stops belonging to the people involved and starts belonging to memory itself. Memory that doesn't reset with new headlines. Memory that doesn't move on just because time has passed. That's why this chapter feels heavier. Not louder, not angrier, heavier. Because once patterns become visible, silence no longer feels neutral. It starts to feel intentional. And once intention is noticed, everything changes. The documentary begins to feel less like a release and more like pressure. Not pressure from accusations, but pressure from continuity. From the realization that once events are lined up, they don't scatter anymore. They hold shape. And shape is dangerous, because shape suggests design. This section slows the pace even further. Instead of pushing ahead, it widens the lens. It asks a quieter question. Not what happened, but why certain moments were allowed to pass without resolution. Why some stories were labeled too complex to revisit. Why explanations were always postponed. And why that later never seemed to arrive. What's unsettling is how familiar the pattern feels once you recognize it. A controversy surfaces. Attention spikes. A brief, controlled statement appears. Then time steps in and cleans up the rest. Time becomes the fixer. The documentary doesn't treat this as coincidence. It treats it as habit. A habit built over years, refined through experience, and shielded by reputation. Because when reputation is strong enough, it fills in the gaps automatically. People assume the explanation exists somewhere, even if they've never actually heard it. Assumption is powerful. It replaces evidence with comfort. Here, the viewer is forced to confront how often comfort was chosen over clarity. How often silence was mistaken for dignity. How frequently unanswered questions were dismissed as old news simply because enough time had passed. But time doesn't resolve stories. It just spreads them out. And when those spaces collapse, when years of moments are compressed into a single viewing, the gaps become impossible to ignore. This is where the documentary shifts away from individuals and towards systems. Systems that understand attention, fatigue, and public memory. Systems that don't rely on denial, but on patience. Patience looks harmless. Patience looks reasonable. Patience rarely looks like avoidance, until you realize it never ends. The film places moments back to back that were never meant to coexist. Not to imply guilt, but to remove isolation. And once isolation disappears, each moment gains weight from the one surrounding it. A pause feels longer. An answer feels shorter. A silence feels heavier. What's striking is how little needs to be said for this to work. There's no narration pushing conclusions, no dramatic declarations. Just proximity, just sequence, just timing. And timing tells stories words never have to. By now, the audience isn't waiting for a reveal. They're waiting for a response. Not a statement, not a denial, but engagement. Something that acknowledges the full picture instead of fragments. Because fragments can be managed. Gaps cannot. This is the point where the story quietly turns. Where silence stops functioning as a shield and starts functioning as evidence of strategy. Not wrongdoing, but strategy. And once strategy becomes visible, the relationship between power and the audience shifts. The audience stops reacting. They start observing. And observation doesn't fade. When the screen goes dark, it lingers. By this stage, the documentary has done something subtle but irreversible. It has changed the viewer's role. You're no longer watching to be informed. You're watching to verify. Every new moment is measured against everything that came before it. Every pause is compared. Every decision not to speak becomes part of the record. This is usually where attention is expected to fade, where momentum should slow, where the audience should move on. But that's not what happens here. Instead, the film leans into repetition, not repeating footage, but repeating behaviors. The same kinds of answers given years apart. The same tone used in entirely different situations. The same reliance on reputation to carry conversations that were never finished. Repetition doesn't feel dramatic. It feels procedural, and procedure suggests intent. What's especially uncomfortable is realizing how effective this approach has been for so long. Not because anyone was deceived, but because the system didn't need deception. It only needed time. Let discomfort dissolve. Let memory fragment. Let delay do what denial never could. And for years, it worked. This chapter reveals that silence wasn't passive. It was active, carefully timed, carefully placed, appearing exactly when clarity would have forced alignment between stories better kept apart. You start noticing how often explanations stop just short of specificity, how conversations pivot away from timelines, how accountability is acknowledged in theory, then softened in practice. Nothing false, nothing provable, just incomplete. Incompleteness is protective. Complete stories demand follow-up. Incomplete ones invite patience. And patience has always favored those in control. What makes this section hit harder is that it never accuses. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't raise its voice. It simply refuses to let moments exist alone anymore. It stacks them. It compresses time. It removes the gaps where forgetting once lived. And once those gaps are gone, something becomes impossible to unsee. Consistency. Not consistency of actions, but consistency of avoidance, of restraint, of knowing exactly how much to say, and more importantly, how much not to. This is where the story becomes heavier. Not because new information appears, but because old information stops feeling resolved. Moments once filed away as handled suddenly feel open again. Unfinished. The documentary quietly challenges a long-standing assumption that silence equals maturity, that not engaging signals wisdom, that moving on always means growth. And it poses a dangerous question without ever asking it outright. What if silence wasn't strength? What if it was insulation? That question lingers. It doesn't demand an answer. It doesn't need one. Because once the viewer asks it themselves, the balance shifts. At this point, the story no longer needs momentum. It has gravity, and gravity doesn't rush. It pulls. Something important changes here in how everything feels. You're no longer wondering what comes next. You're watching how everyone moves now that the room knows it's being watched. Because once patterns are visible, reactions matter more than revelations. The documentary doesn't chase drama. It slows down. It lets silence stretch just long enough for you to notice who's comfortable inside it and who isn't. That contrast matters. Some speak freely. Others create distance. Not because they have nothing to say, but because saying anything creates a reference point. And reference points are dangerous when the past is being reassembled instead of forgotten. This is where the audience stops consuming and starts measuring. Measuring tone, measuring timing, measuring how quickly narratives adjust as quiet pressure builds. And pressure does build, not loudly, not publicly, but internally, inside structures that once relied on time to blur details. Time isn't blurring anything anymore. Every resurfaced interview feels different now. Every old clip carries new weight. Statements that once sounded neutral now feel calculated. Not false, calculated. Designed to say enough without ever closing the loop. That's the tension living beneath this part of the story. Nothing explosive happens here, and that's exactly why it works. Explosions burn out. Patterns don't. Patterns settle in. They stay. They don't ask to be believed. They repeat until recognition becomes unavoidable. What's unsettling is how predictable the responses become once the system is visible. The pauses arrive at the same moments. The language softens around the same subjects. Accountability is acknowledged, then redirected. This isn't chaos. It's control. And control doesn't panic when questioned. It waits. It assumes patience will turn into fatigue. that attention will drift. That curiosity will give up before coherence is required. But that assumption is breaking. The audience isn't asking louder questions. They're asking steadier ones. They're no longer reacting emotionally. They're watching structurally, watching how narratives protect themselves without ever admitting they need protection. This is where silence stops being neutral. Silence becomes a signal that certain explanations would bring more clarity than comfort. A signal that some conversations are riskier to complete than to avoid. A signal that distance still feels safer than alignment. And once you recognize that it can't be unseen, the documentary never spells this out. It doesn't need to. It trusts the viewer to reach that realization on their own. And conclusions reached independently carry more weight than anything handed to you. This is where the story grows heavier without getting louder, where the absence of response begins to speak more forcefully than any statement ever could, where every quiet choice adds pressure instead of easing it. From this point on, every move is read differently, not because accusations are made, not because anything is definitively proven, but because silence no longer feels like the end of the conversation. By now, the audience understands something quietly powerful. This story no longer needs new material to survive. It feeds on what already exists and on what still hasn't been addressed. The documentary stops pulling information forward and lets absence do the work instead. You start noticing how certain names fade from discussion, how some voices go quiet precisely when context would matter most, how responses shorten as questions sharpen. That silence isn't accidental. It's measured. What stands out is how restraint is used as a tool. Not restraint as discipline, but restraint as positioning. Saying less, appearing less, explaining less. Because explanation leaves a trail, and trails invite comparison. Comparison is the real threat. The film shows how narratives endure not by controlling every detail, but by controlling engagement. If you don't engage, you don't create new material. If no new material exists, old material remains unresolved rather than challenged. That unresolved space is where power prefers to sit. But unresolved doesn't mean invisible. It means suspended. And suspension creates tension. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that tightens. This chapter allows that tension to breathe. It doesn't rush toward another reveal. It stays with the discomfort. It lets the viewer sit with the realization that for years, many moments were treated as isolated incidents when they were actually part of a continuous pattern. Once that realization lands, everything changes. Old statements sound different. Past confidence feels rehearsed. Distance feels deliberate. Not because something new has been proven, but because coherence starts replacing coincidence. The audience begins to notice who is comfortable speaking broadly and who avoids specifics, who leans into clarity and who circles endlessly around it. These aren't dramatic shifts. They're subtle, and subtlety is where long-term strategies live. This is where the documentary becomes dangerous, not to individuals, but to systems. Systems built on the belief that patience will outlast curiosity. Systems that expect attention to move on before connections fully form. That expectation no longer holds. The audience isn't rushing. They're waiting, watching, remembering. And quiet observation doesn't burn out the way outrage does. It doesn't need fresh fuel. It feeds on consistency. The more consistent the avoidance, the clearer the structure becomes. This is the phase where the story stops asking for reaction and starts inviting evaluation. An evaluation doesn't require belief. It requires memory. Memory that now stretches across years without gaps. Once those gaps close, silence loses its cover. It no longer looks like maturity or restraint. It looks like a choice repeated often enough to become visible. That's where everything shifts. Not because of one clip, not because of a shocking moment, but because the story stops feeling accidental. Up until now, it was easy to dismiss this as noise. Just another documentary, just another cycle of headlines. But here, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The lens changes. You're no longer watching for revelations. You're watching for reactions. and the reactions, or the lack of them, tell a deeper story than any footage ever could. This is when viewers begin to understand that power doesn't collapse when exposed. It adapts, it slows, it grows quieter, because silence buys time, and time has always been a safe place for unfinished stories. But this time isn't erasing anything. It's stacking it. You notice how quickly narratives drift away from specifics. How conversations that once felt confident turn vague. How explanations stop just short of clarity. Not denial, not confirmation, just distance. Distance is the strategy. Once you see that, the past rearranges itself. Old interviews take on new weight. Statements that once felt complete now feel carefully framed. Moments dismissed as coincidence begin lining up with uncomfortable precision. At this point, the documentary stops guiding and lets the viewer connect the dots alone. And when conclusions are reached that way, they don't feel planted. They feel earned. That's the turning point. Not when something new is said, but when nothing new needs to be said at all. From here on, silence becomes data. Every pause is noticed. Every absence is logged. Every non-response adds pressure instead of releasing it. And pressure doesn't need noise to work. It only needs consistency. This is where the balance quietly shifts. The narrative no longer belongs to the people at its center. It belongs to the timeline itself, to memory, comparison, and context. The audience stops asking what will be revealed next and starts asking why so much was never addressed before. That question doesn't fade. It deepens because it isn't accusatory. It's structural. It asks how long certain conversations were allowed to remain unfinished, how often clarity was postponed, how frequently silence was mistaken for resolution. Once that pattern is recognized, the story becomes irreversible. Not louder, not messier, just heavier. From this point forward, everything that follows is measured against what didn't happen before. And that's a standard silence can't escape. This isn't the peak of drama. It's the moment gravity takes over.